Okay, so today we're going to look at Wittgenstein and his view on specifically religious language. The key idea here is a little bit complicated because there are really two kinds of Wittgenstein. There's the Wittgenstein writing in the early part of his life, and then there's the later Wittgenstein who changes his views somewhat on what he thinks. But essentially, the key idea is that religious language, I'll just write RL, is not, so an equal sign with a dash through it means not factual. So just like the logical positivists, in a way, Wittgenstein thinks that language about religious claims is non-factual in nature. But, he says, religious language is meaningful in a kind of different way. It doesn't have factual meaning, but it is some sort of game that we play that has purpose within that game. So broadly, the two different views, the kind of early Wittgenstein says that that religious language is just not meaningful. That's where he says, look, only fact claims matter. But later he then reforms that, and he says that actually it does form a role. Religious language plays a very particular kind of role in our lives and is very important. So the reason I've done this is just to distinguish between kind of the two stages for Wittgenstein. He has these in two different books. The early book is the Tractatus, Logico-Philosophicus, which is written all in like really short sentences or very, very short paragraphs, all numbered and clear. And then the later one, when he comes back to philosophy, is the Philosophical Investigations, where he changes his mind on a whole range of issues. So let's start over here. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein says that only factual statements have meaning. Because, as he says at the beginning, the world is all that there is. So only statements about the world can possibly mean anything. Now, this is very similar to a logical positivist, but he is not a logical positivist. He's not a logical positivist because he thinks that other statements, so big old but, other statements have meaning and purpose. So other statements matter too. They just aren't meaningful. For instance, moral statements is a really good example of something that matters, but it's not something that that really kind of affects anything. That is about the world. If we imagine the world is this, it's a great big group of facts, and that is all that it is. The world exists as a set of kind of things that are true, just like a logical positivist would say. Then what he's saying is that the set of facts is always the same. Okay. But, and here's the really kind of important point, the kind of religious statements are a kind of spin on that. So they're a different view, but the facts are always the same. Okay. And to distinguish between the two views, he draws a distinction between meaningful statements and mystical statements. So meaningful statements are simply facts alone. So fact, kind of science statements. As he says, in the world, everything is as it is. Okay, that's what I mean here when I say that just there are a set of facts. In it, no value exists, and if it did exist, it would have no value. In other words, there's no spin, there's no requirement, there's no anything. There's just a set of facts. But mystical language, on the other hand, mystical language is non-meaningful. So meaningless, but hugely important. And this is where religious language sits in the Tractatus. So he thinks that through these we can find higher meaning, even though it is meaningless. Does that make sense to you? I think, the commentator Paul Engelman puts it like this. He says, I'm not going to write it down for you, but here's what he says. He says, Wittgenstein passionately believes that all that really matters in life is precisely what, in his view, we must be silent about. So the things that actually matter are things that we can't talk about in a meaningful way. This is as opposed to his later philosophical work. In the philosophical investigations, he thinks that the claims he's made in the Tractatus are wrong. So he says specifically, what's wrong about what he said before is that language is not just science, not just scientific. So he's wrong about science because it's not all language. There is language that is non-scientific in nature. But just because we use the same words doesn't mean we're engaged in the same activity. So the same words are not the same activity or the same game. So this is where he brings in his concept of a game. Just like, say, in rugby and in football, there's a foul. The type of foul that it is means something completely different in both contexts because they're playing different games. And those are literally games, right? Those are sports games. But he thinks that all language groups are also games. He thinks that every kind of different language, I don't mean like French or German or English, but I mean different language group, has a different aim. A different thing it's trying to communicate, and therefore it's literally playing a different game. So whilst there are some relations, language in, say, let's put this in a different colour, in geography, where we might describe the shape of a hill, is not the same at all as when we do so in poetry. We're trying to communicate something entirely different in poetry as opposed to the language in geography. So the different kind of languages, and these are two examples of languages, are different games. So different language, different game, is his point. And therefore different aim, and different reference points. These terms gain their meaning, for want of a better word, from within the game, from common reference points that the players of the game kind of understand. They're not always representative of reality. So they don't always aim to represent a set of facts. Look at the geography versus poetry example. In geography, we're trying to represent facts about a hill. In poetry, we're doing something entirely different with a different set of kind of meanings. So when we turn to religious language here, it has its own set of rules in the game, in its game. So in religious language, it would be wrong if it tried to communicate facts. If saying, like, the claim God exists or God is omnipotent is a fact claim, then it's wrong. It's just factually incorrect. But it's not wrong, it's just something completely different when expressing an emotion or a mystical reaction, or when it's a kind of religious devotion. So let's take an example, and that I think might kind of help us somewhat. So let's take the example when a religious person says, as you've studied in this course, when they say something like, God is omnipotent. Okay. Omnipotent, of course, remember, means what? Yes, all-powerful. So it's wrong if that's a claim about a fact. It's not a fact. So it's wrong in that way. So if we're saying that there literally is a God that is commanding you to behave in a particular way, that can do anything, right? If there's a God that can do anything, that's wrong. But if what we mean by that is a way of kind of improving our own behavior, knowing that there is some sort of God, or believing that there's a God that can do anything, then that's very, very, very different. These are sentiments, essentially. They are not claims about the world. If they are, they're meaningless. But if they are sentiments, then they are meaningful. But he thinks they're not reducible to mere emotions. They're their own. Religious language is its own game. So that's Wittgenstein on religious language.